Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Marion and Josie and others that have organised to get me here. I'm really excited to be here today. Is one of those unique occasions as a speaker where you speak to a room full of people that are really kindred spirits. In fact, so much so kindred spirits that actually it was really hard to write this talk. Because usually I'm talking to people about some fundamentals of behaviour change or the need for engagement and talking to target audiences and communities, but that's a given here. So I've been trying to find, as I thought about things to talk about, find some areas that might be interesting or useful, but it was hard. So my name's Liam. I run a research unit at Monash University called BehaviourWorks Australia. We have about 30 researchers and we only do applied behaviour change research. So we're interested in making a difference, actually. And we've done about 300 projects in a whole raft of areas, in environmental spaces, in social, financial, and health, to try and make a difference through behaviour change. And I think I guess over the course of those projects we've learned a lot, and what I really wanted to do is share some of that learning today. I'm hoping this works. I often put up this slide. Some of you may have seen this, particularly anyone that's dabbled in behaviour change before. This is a slide that shows the percentage of positive decisions made by judges across the time of the day. And what we see is a lot of favourable decisions first thing in the morning, and it drops away rapidly. And we see some more favourable decisions sort of mid-morning, and that drops away. And then we see more favourable decisions early afternoon, and they drop away. Why is this? Food! Human behaviour is fascinating, and I often put this slide up really to just showcase where I'm sitting in the proceedings. And I'm lucky because I'm right at the start. So you've all eaten, I've got your attention, and I'm in a privileged position. I'm glad I'm not just before morning tea or just before lunch. Apologies to those people that are in sessions at that time. I want to start this presentation with a story, and all you who consult with communities will know the power of stories. And this story is a personal one, and it's about a light switch. And it started for me about 15 years ago when I was based at an outer eastern campus of Monash University in Berwick. So for people from Melbourne, you may know where that is. And we had this issue that we had a light switch in the lunchroom that no one was turning off. And we needed to get behaviour change. Actually not me, there was another group called the Office of Environment and Sustainability, TOES, they were called. Our TOES thought long and hard about how we're going to get people to turn off the light. And they worked out that academics believe in evidence, because mostly academics use in the lunchroom. Therefore, they believe in climate change. So a message about climate change would work. And so we got a little sign just above the light, and apologies for the quality of the photo because this is back when phones had no megapixel photos. And it said, please switch off the light. You can help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Compelling, yes. Did it work? Didn't work, no. Didn't work at all, in fact. Made no difference whatsoever. So TOES went back to the drawing board and thought, well, maybe that's not the problem. Maybe we don't need to convince them that it will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe what we need to do, or maybe the problem actually is that the people using that lunchroom don't know where the light switch is. So we got another sign which told us where the light switch was. So now we knew it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we knew exactly where the light switch was, and so surely now we should be turning off the light. Was this effective? No. Made no difference whatsoever. So Toes went back to the drawing board again and they said, well, what can we do next? They said, well, I think I know the problem. The problem is that people believe if you turn the light switch off and then on again, it uses more power than if you just leave it on. Yeah? So we got a nice big sign that told us exactly that. And it's not very clear here, but in red stamps it says busted, the myths are busted, right? Now this came, we're sort of talking over a course of several weeks, and did this make a difference? No, it didn't. It didn't change behaviour either. Now the next sign is one that you're probably quite familiar with. Anyone that's had issues in their lunchroom or in their fridge, the workplace fridge, have probably seen a sign pretty similar to this. Which was where we landed. Was this effective? Actually slightly, made a little difference, but not much. And in the end, what happened? We automated the lights. So the story here is an interesting one because I guess we had lots of great ideas about how we can change behaviour, but none of them really worked. And it's interesting to try and think, why? Why didn't that sign work? Why did none of those things make a difference? And I think there's kind of two reasons that jump out at me. Number one is that all they had, the only tool they had to change behaviour, was a persuasive message. Persuasive messages can work, don't get me wrong, particularly if they're delivered by someone who really matters to you or whose opinions you care about. But not always. So all they had was a persuasive message and a poster or a sign. And there might have been a raft of other tools that weren't at their disposal, but they may have been more effective. And I'll talk a bit about habits breaking later on. The other reason why the sign might not have worked is because the people who they were trying to persuade, the people they were trying to get to switch the lights off, were actually more different to them than they thought. They cared about different things. They were passionate about different issues, and they weren't really interested in their messages. And you all recognise this more than anyone, that oftentimes your target audience or the people you're trying to engage are not like you. And when I thought about the people who are most not like me to put up on a slide, all I could think of was Collingwood fans. So I don't know how that joke goes down in Gold Coast, but anyway, they are a beast to themselves. So, back to the point before, I really struggled with what I would talk about today, and so I thought probably the best thing to do would be to paint a bit of a smorgasbord. Some of the tools and methods and ways that our unit tries to influence behaviour or undertakes research or uses tools to help understand people and understand what might work or what has a better chance of working. So I'll start by just talking about what we have in common, because as all you practitioners know who work in community engagement, the first thing you need to do is find the common ground. Then I'll talk a little bit about what not to do when you're trying to change behaviour. Things that I see oftentimes in government. I know there are a lot of people in government that are not particularly effective. I'll talk through a behaviour change process. I do want to touch on when not to consult. When a target audience, perhaps it's not a good idea to talk to them. We'll move over to some simple behaviour change tools, because I'd hate to leave you without here some way of manipulating your husband or wife or partner or kids or something. So I'll give you some of those tools near the end. And then I'll flip over to some tools for changing habits, because habits are a particular difficult space. And lastly, really briefly, I want to touch on some areas where I think there's going to be big social shift in the future, and areas where I imagine you in the room will spend a lot of time focusing. So what do we have in common? This is a methodology which I'll talk about actually a little bit later in more detail. But this is a methodology that our research unit uses to help make decisions about what behaviour change tools might work and to trial them. And I was looking at this in relation to when we engage with communities, or whether those communities, and what type of communities. And I worked out most of the time. So as researchers and people who are interested in delivering behaviour change programs, we know the value of consulting. It's imperative. There are 3 primary audiences that we talk to a lot. We certainly talk to the partners, the people we work with. We talk to our audiences, the people whose behaviour we want to change. And we certainly talk to other broad stakeholders. And this is my best PowerPoint skills, to blend one colour to another. In fact, there's 3 colours there if you look closely. But really, I just wanted to emphasise that what you do is core business to us. I guess the key difference between perhaps the work that you do and maybe not, I might get this wrong here, but we particularly consult and particularly talk to our audiences about behaviour. We want to know why people are doing the things they do and why they're not doing those things. So particularly when we're speaking to an audience whose behaviour you want to change, we will ask questions of them specifically about the behaviour. And the behaviourist sees the world as being made up of people doing things. Thousands of little things. Whether it's jiggling your hands to Shania Twain or offsetting your carbon when you fly. We see the world as made up of hundreds, thousands of behaviours. We make many behaviours every day. And we try and pick particular ones that we think are going to make a difference and talk to audiences about them. These are the 3 questions we ask. What are the good outcomes that happen if you do it? What are the bad outcomes that happen if you do the behaviour? Who would approve? Who would disapprove? What makes it easy and what makes it hard? They're really simple questions. And we would ask these of every target audience we engage with. Why? Because we know that largely the main reason why people do things, actually there's a few, but 3 of the main reasons are: we think it's a good idea to do it, we feel pressure to do it, and we can do it. So these questions get that out. And we ask this again and again. It's underpinned by theory, which you don't need to know about. I'm happy to talk to others if they're interested in the why these questions work and the model of theory and how then you use that to design intervention programs. But I think these are the first starting questions that are really important. Okay, so that's what we have in common and maybe a little bit what we have in difference. I may be wrong, but that's my assumption. I do want to talk about what not to do now, besides putting up a whole bunch of posters to get people to switch off the light. And I've categorised this into 3 really common mistakes. Mistakes is a loaded word, but it grabs people's attention and that's good, I guess. 3 really common mistakes. So those of you in government will probably see your department making these mistakes. Those of you in private will probably see people making these mistakes as well. And the first one is to jump in without unpacking a problem, understanding it in great depth. I think that's fundamental. And a little exercise for you. I want you to picture in your head someone who has been reported to our roads authority as being medically unfit to drive. Everyone got a picture in their head? Medically unfit to drive, so they don't have the for some medical reasons they're not fit to drive. Who said someone like this? Come on, be honest. A few, all right. Who said someone like this? A couple. Who said someone like this? A couple, all right. Okay, that's interesting. You might be surprised, this is the data from VicRoads of people who have been reported, the age profile of people who have been reported in 2016 for being medically unfit to drive. Oh, sorry, by the way, you'd be most accurate if you chose this guy. Why? Because men tend to be really bad at self-regulating, so knowing when they're not good drivers. Women tend to realise I'm not a good driver, so I'll take myself out. Men, you need a crowbar to get them out, I think. And the evidence supports that, guys, so sorry, we're in the wrong here. But you might be surprised to see the age profile of people who are reported. It's a bit different to what I would have thought. 2/3 of them are under the age of 75. And 75 is like the new 20, so... So actually, these are younger people than we had in our heads, right? So it just takes a really short look at this to see, well, actually, I shouldn't jump in, because otherwise I'd be designing a program to change behaviour or get people to go and see the doctor, which is actually what I want people to do, by using Probus groups or Rotary groups or University of Third Age, or assuming what might work. But actually, we'd be wrong. The next graph shows who goes to see the doctor and submits their paperwork. And what do we see here? Well, we see actually that the 50 to 70-year-olds really like their licences. And so they go and see the doctor and they submit their paperwork. We see a lot of people in the over 70, this is the red bar, over 70 saying, it's probably too much. That's the thing I don't want. And then the under 30s and under 50 to 30 to 50 are pretty similar. But if you break that down to who submits on time, which is basically the green bar before divided into two, into a green and an orange, which means they submitted their paperwork but they did it late, we see that actually the under 30s and under 50s do it, they're just late. The point really here is a couple of graphs. I mean, they're not that interesting really, but they change your perception about what you might do to change behaviour. So jumping in and making assumptions is really dangerous. Now, I don't probably need to tell you that, but it's a really common mistake. The second category of mistake is I know what works. And we're all guilty of this, because when I was introduced as a leading expert or something, but when it comes to my kids, I only have one strategy. It's to yell louder and louder and louder. But when I work with our partners, I put that aside and I'm a little more measured. So I know what works. It's dangerous. And I'm going to pick out three particular things. The first is that we give people information that will change their behaviour. We know this one. And I think probably the best case study of this is in climate change. We know about climate change. It is definitive. The evidence is solid. We know conclusively about it. And yet this poor scientist is going through a process of trying to tell people about climate change and the fact we need to do something about it, and realising that no one's listening, even with the best evidence and the best information. It's kind of sad in some ways. My old director, the director of the Sustainable Development Institute, said, "This is my life, Liam. That's my life." He was a climate scientist. A second one is around incentives. Now, I'm just going to be a little cautious with incentives, because there are circumstances where they can be effective, but they're often not effective. And here's a classic, a very good, well-known case study in childcare. It's actually a disincentive rather than an incentive. A guy called Erinesi, a researcher, an Israeli researcher, had kids in a childcare facility. And one day he was running late. And he drove like mad to get there on time, with no punishment whatsoever if he was late. Broke all the speeding rules, swerved in front of other cars, mad rush to get there late. And often, well, it seemed that enough people were doing the same thing. So the childcare centre got a bit sick of it. They said, right, we're going to fine people who are late. And they introduced a fine of about 10 shekels, which is about 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 Australian dollars. Someone might convert that better than me, but not a lot. And what happened when they did that? Someone guess, yeah? Bingo. Sorry. So late pickups doubled. Doubled. There's another case, very famous case study from the 70s where they started paying people for giving blood. $7. And I went on to a currency converter that converts that into modern day dollars from the early 70s, which is about 40 Australian dollars for giving blood. And by paying people $7, or $40 in today's terms, it led to a decrease in the number of people giving blood. Why? Well, probably because, and the term that economists use is, we crowd out the good reasons why people do things. We get rid of the really important reasons, because people weren't giving blood because they wanted money. They were giving blood because they liked it. They thought it was the right thing to do. It made them feel like a good citizen. People weren't trying to get to the childcare centre on time for any financial motivation. It was because they had a kind of an unwritten social contract with the carer saying, I'll turn up on time, you look after my kid, right? Deal. So you do need to be careful with incentives. By the way, I often survey the room to listen, or not the whole room, so it's this big, but listen to different punishments for picking up kids late. The best one I've heard so far is in France, a place in Paris, where if you don't turn up to pick up your kid on time, they get taken on the dot to the police station, where you can then collect them from. In that case, the disincentive would work, right? Which is why Urinisi says, pay enough or don't pay at all. And it's a general good rule about incentives. A third kind of string to the I know what works bow, and this is probably the most common mistake we see, is that we need to tell people how big problems are. Here's a huge issue. We need to do something about it. It's a great challenge and we need to address it, and that will be persuasive. Now, to show you why this is a mistake, I'm going to give you a little example in energy. We've also seen these in other utility bills as well. But who has received a bill at some point in the last few years that tells them how much energy their neighbour is using? No? A few, yep. Not their right next, not one neighbour, like neighbours, sorry. Neighbours, people in your community. And what we find is that by telling people how much energy they're using, their neighbours are using, we can get them to reduce it if they're using more. If they're using less and you give them a smiley face like this person here, they'll stay down. And over really big studies, meta-analyses we call them in research, this is proven to work. It's only a small change, but it's proven to work. The interesting thing about this study is the very first time they did it, Wes Schultz and Bob Cialdini, is they told people what their neighbours were using, but they didn't have any smiley faces. So what happened was all the high-end users, they came down and started using less. But what happened to the low-end users? They came up. Why? Because we all like to be normal. It probably has its histories in evolutionary psychology. When everyone's running, you run too, because that's a smart thing to do. But we all like to be normal. It's inherent in us. There are points of difference, no doubt. But if there's 1 million hits on YouTube for a video that's just gone up yesterday, you can bet your bottom dollar you want to watch it too. We follow norms. Why is this important? Because if we emphasise problems as being really big, what does it tell us? It tells us it's normal. When we talk about an ice crisis, an ice epidemic, or an obesity crisis, or how many people are doing the wrong thing in emitting carbon or whatever, it tells us that's normal, and it makes the problem worse. That's why the media do not talk about suicide. Because if we talked about the number of people committing suicide, it would, both through copycats but also through norming, get more people to do it. So we need to be really careful about emphasising problems. It's not to say there isn't a valid place for talking about them. Of course there is, particularly to get them on the public agenda. And if I think about something like family violence, which is very much on the agenda at the moment, it takes a while, a lot of lobbying and over a long period of time to get that on the agenda. But I think now that governments are committing around the country to doing something about it, now is the time to stop talking about the size of the problem, because it normalises it. Confronting, I know, but worth noting. Bob Cialdini calls it the great mistake. Of course, there's other ways to think about, and this is a strategy from our roads insurer in Victoria. It's about towards zero, which is, I think, a much better strategy in sort of communicating what the organisation wants to achieve. All right, the third mistake is just using one tool. We know that almost always we can get significant change, and this is smoking. Smoking rates, believe it or not, in the early 80s were around a third of Australians. It's hard to believe that now. This graph stops at 2007, but this one continues. It shows we're just under 10% of smokers now, and it's because of a raft of things. It's not one thing, it's lots of things over a long period of time that's been successful. So there are three mistakes. I'm now going to talk about, I guess, partly how to avoid those mistakes, but also a methodology for designing better behaviour change programs. And I said I'd talk about this at the start, and so I'll just go through it now. And I do so because I think some of the questions that we ask during this process may be useful to you as people who engage with communities of different ilks. In the exploration phase, there are a few key questions we're interested in answering. First is around what's the bigger picture? What's the system look like? Who are the actors involved? What are the processes? And we often use system mapping, and I'm sure some of you have used similar tools in your processes, but drawing boxes and arrows that link different institutions and actors together to say, actually, I'm not just interested in this. There's a whole network of people and actors that support this system. And they all could be your target audiences for change, by the way. So understanding a bigger picture is really important. Is the problem different for different groups? Really common question. We do market segmentations and these sorts of things which are really useful. But it's the sort of question you could tease out through community consultation. What does the evidence say? Chances are you're not the first place in the world to have been facing this problem. There'll be others that have faced a similar problem, so what can you learn from them? Who needs to do what differently to fix it? We spent a lot of time thinking about this question, by the way. I've got 2 doctoral students that have spent a lot of time, just finished actually, both of them, just trying to answer this question. Who needs to do what differently? Or how to answer that question is probably a better way of thinking about it. And which one should we focus on? So they're the questions that we have. I see a lot of you taking photos. Great. I'm happy to make these slides available in whatever format you need. I won't actually go through that just because it's a bit long. Some of the questions we go through in deep dive, this is where we've focused on one particular behaviour and we're trying to understand why people do and don't do it. What are the drivers and barriers of the behaviour? They're those 3 questions I asked before. What's been tried before? What might an intervention look like? And in the application phase, this is where we're trialling things, putting things out into field, seeing what works. In behaviour change, it's ruthless, right? It either works or it doesn't. We live and die by the sword. And we've had some failures, several. In fact, one time we introduced a huge intervention that led to an increase in the problem, which is the importance of doing the trialling. I often think about behaviour change and all these tools, essentially all they do is increase the odds that what you do will work, but there's no guarantee. So these questions, does our intervention work? Are there any unintended consequences? If we change here, how might it affect there? And how can we embed in behavioural thinking into the organisation, which is more just about what do we do with the results once we've done it, and how do we build capacity? And there's some of the application tools. I did want to touch on this question of when not to consult. Just last week, one of our partners did some focus groups around messages for people who are alcohol and drug affected and on a road to recovery, to get them to go to and attend an appointment. So actually what happens a lot is that people who are in alcohol and drug rehabilitation don't attend appointments, and it actually costs the state a lot of money, about $560 actually, per time they don't turn up. And so they're really keen to design messages that get people to turn up to their appointments. And they ran a focus group too, in fact, with people who are in the target audience, and asked them about a whole bunch of messages. And the resounding feedback from those groups was, we hate this. We hate it. If you sent me that message, not only would it not work, I would deliberately not go. I would deliberately not go to my appointment, or I'd pull out because you're talking to me like that. Truth is, the evidence is pretty heavy to show that most of those messages will work. There's no guarantee, as I said, it doesn't always work, but most of those have pretty good evidence, including in that community or in that type of community. And therefore, our partners have got really nervous and don't want to even trial these messages. So, and most of these messages are actually designed on what we call nudges. Many of you may have read the book Nudge or know about nudging, choice architecture. So they act on people in very subconscious ways, or less conscious ways is probably a better way of putting it. So they change behaviour, but they don't necessarily change behaviour through thinking. And we call these generic behaviour change tools, and there are a lot of them. I'm going to tell you some of them shortly. But I think this is an example where I don't think it's a good idea to consult with the community. That sounds controversial, but almost certainly what will happen in this particular study is that these messages won't get sent out, and we won't know. By the way, if you run a trial with 6 or 8 messages, which is what we were planning, chances are one of them will work better than control. In fact, in text messages, which are reminders, generally speaking, any message versus no message is a big effect. Just reminding people of an appointment. So I think it's worth considering. There are times, in particular when you're using some of these nudge strategies, which I'll articulate in the next slide, it's not probably the best idea because they don't work through conscious processing. Where we want to change behaviour by making people think and weigh up the pros and cons and say, I'm not sure if that's a good outcome or if that's a good outcome, or and they're very much thinking about the behaviour and then acting, great. That's when we do want to consult, but when we're not in that space, I would argue no. So what are some of these generic behaviour change tools? I said I'd give you some tools to change your kids or your spouse or your friend's behaviour. Often actually I start these conferences by saying behaviour change is easy, I just want everyone to stand up and I'll demonstrate, and I say thank you. Right? But actually we saw it when we got Jazz Hands and Shania Twain, it's kind of not very exciting anymore. So there are tools that we can use. Who would have thought that they would be dancing to Shania Twain first thing in the morning? Oh, it's Taylor Swift, sorry. Someone told me that, I got that wrong, sorry. Taylor Swift. Very good. Who would have thought they'd be doing that? I have a 14-year-old daughter too, so I feel embarrassed. look, there are lots of these tools, and these are 4 that you can go and access and have a look at. I'm going to talk about just one of them because I think they're most relevant to the work that you do. But you can go and look up all these tools that they exist. We put together a toolkit called Inspire, which is about how we can improve our written communications to get people to do what we want. The Behavioural Insights team from the UK have this EAST framework, which some of you may be familiar with. You can look that up. They'll talk through that. Susan Mickey has a whole bunch. Has a what's called a behaviour change wheel, which matches sort of the intervention type to the reason why people are doing the behaviour or not doing it. And there are some tools in there that are around nudgy sort of stuff. And she's identified over 100 behaviour change techniques, by the way. And then lastly, but not least, and this is the one I'm going to talk about, is a book first published in the early 90s by a guy called Robert Cialdini in influence, or principles of persuasion. And so I'm just going to talk through these because I think these have some relevance to the work you do. And I encourage you to sort of think about the work you do and how you could use these principles to, let's put it bluntly, manipulate people. The first one is social proof. And actually, I've already explained this one. If we know what other people are doing, we will follow the herd. It's in our DNA. We see this in original candid camera videos. Has anyone seen where they go and 3 people face backwards and the 4th person comes in and they don't know what's going on and slowly they turn around and face the same way as everyone else? Yep. And the very first social norming study I'm aware of actually was done in New York where they got 3 or 4 people to look up in the sky and, oh, look at that. And then traffic stopped and they had to can this study very quickly. So we like to be normal, we like to follow norms. So the tools you can use is to emphasise the norms. We know in UK they send out tax letters. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. Well, it increases £6 million into the coffers early in particular audiences. Pretty simple message. The other thing around social proof is you can talk about trends. So if the numbers don't work in your favour, which they sometimes don't, so it may be that only 1 person out of 10 pays their tax on time. You can also use trends by saying, last year no one paid their tax on time. This year we're on track for half a person out of 10 paying their tax on time, and next year we're aiming for 1. It's probably not a good example. Let's go 3, 4, 5. 3 out of 10 did it, 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10. This is a trend. And people like trends, they follow them. It's in our DNA. So social proof, great tool. Whether that's getting people to come to a session, to participate in a session, to follow up afterwards. This is sorts of messages that you could use. I would argue there's a good space. Commitment strategies. Commitment strategies are ways of bridging the gap between intention and behaviour. Now, we all have good intentions to do lots of things, don't we? And the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So how do we get people to actually do the things that they intend to do? Well, in my view, using commitment strategies is number 1. Getting them to commit to doing it. And there's 3 essential ingredients in commitments. Number 1, they need to be active. i.e. you do something to make the commitment rather than don't do something. I'll give you an example. They did a trial in the UK about, again, trying to get people to turn up to their medical appointments. And it made a significant difference if people filled out their own appointment cards versus the receptionist filling it out for them. So the commitment was active. They did it themselves. Secondly, they should be effortful. So the more effort you put in to the commitment, the more likely is people will follow through. So if the commitment cards, if I've got to walk across the room to go and get one, or the appointment card, get one, walk back, fill it in, that's more effortful than just filling it in. And we know the more effortful, even seemingly significant things like that will make it more likely people will follow through on their commitments. The third thing, which is probably the magic ingredient, is commitments that are made public work best. Where we tell everyone what we're going to do. Social media is a wonderful thing for this. You can use that as a way of getting people to follow through on commitments. The more public, the better. Reciprocation. We feel indebted to those that have given to us first. I'm thinking about some of the processes we've done in terms of citizens, juries and the like, and what we often do is say, come and participate, we'll send you out a whole bunch of stuff where you can come and participate in our jury or our panel, and then afterwards you'll get paid by someone else. That's a very much you do first and we pay later. If you flip that, you're more likely to get follow through. So if you give first, people are much more likely to respond. I'm not saying you'd pay them in advance, maybe that's a bit naive. But certainly if you gave them something in advance that was a benefit or helpful to them. The Hare Krishnas know this beautifully. They've been banned from doing it now in most countries. But they used to come up and give you a book or a flower. Here's a gift from us. Oh, thanks, that's great. Now can you donate to the Hare Krishna Fund? And you'd say, oh, actually I don't want the book. And they said, no, that's a gift. Can you donate? And they wouldn't take the gift back. And they work primarily on the notion of reciprocity. The other thing about reciprocity is it works immediately well, but it fades over time. So if I give you something now, you're likely to want to pay me back very soon and immediately. But in a year's time, you're less likely. You've probably forgotten about it. And by the way, it works the other way for the giver. So I might give you something now, don't worry about it, don't pay me back. And then in a year's time I go, hang on a minute, I gave that to you. So it actually crosses paths. So the point really about reciprocity is if you give first, yes, great, but ask for something in return soon. Liking. People we like influence our behaviour. We like people who are attractive. We like people who are similar to us. And we will comply with them. Lots and lots of research on this came out of particularly Yale through the 50s and 60s. And also related to that is the idea of authority, which is that we respond to people who are authoritative. So people who have titles, people who are tall, people who wear lab coats. We tend to follow these people in positions of authority and are more likely to adhere to them. And lastly, but not least, is scarcity. We chase things that there's not many left. I don't know how many of you have been on Webjet or something similar when it says only 2 tickets left at this price. Does it make us really want to get those tickets? Absolutely. And in the spirit of scarcity, I bought about 20 books of our method, which are on a table over the back there. And you're welcome to help yourself, but there's only 20. It cost us a lot to print, so we're not printing off 300. But there's a whole bunch of them over on the table over there if you want to go and get one. But we chase things that are rare. Okay, I just did want to spend a few minutes on talking about habits before I wrap up. I'm just conscious of time. I've got a little bit of time left. Habits are really interesting things. They're defined by 3 core properties. Number 1 is we do them often. That makes sense. Number 2 is they're cued by the context we find ourselves in. So if you find yourself in your bathroom, you find yourself doing things without conscious thought. The fact that you are in your bathroom, you are doing them. Or if you're in your kitchen, you're doing them. So they're cued by the environment. Yep. And the third, I guess, part of habits is that we do them without conscious thought. We don't think. So often when people are in habits mode, and oftentimes people will be, you're trying to change habitual behaviour, you need to recognise that people have tunnel vision. They look like this. Habits are wonderful things for us. They are wonderful because it means we don't have to think about everything. Now, being a tourist is fun, but when you go and be a tourist in a different city, you spend a lot of your time working out what you're going to eat, where you're going to go, how you're going to get around, where you're going to sleep, and a lot of your brain is used up for doing those things. And it's fun for a while, but if you had to live a life like that, you wouldn't have a lot of time for other things, like we're doing today. Pondering, thinking about how that might apply to my world or my work. So they're very efficient and they're useful and they serve us well. But if we want to change them, it's hard because people have tunnel vision and your information is not in their tunnel vision. It's actually really hard to break the habits of people. To give you a couple of demonstrations, or actually I'll just talk about the toolkit first, I think. There is a bit of a toolkit for changing habits. When we have crises, they can work. Incentives and policies can work if they're significant enough. Like I said, Uri said, pay enough or don't pay at all. And there are also these things called moments of discontinuity. I'll just explain these briefly. This is a diagram that shows the number of behaviours that changed in 3 different audiences, men, women and total, after a stroke or a heart attack. You'd think that's a pretty significant thing, right? It is. And in fact, we do get behaviour change. On average, I think it's about 1.2 behaviours change. But I would argue it's not very much. And in fact, in men, nearly 30% don't change anything in their lifestyle after a stroke or a heart attack. That's kind of scary. It's almost like our habits are like our heartbeat and they're a rhythm. And you can have it disrupted, literally in this case, but we very quickly go back into our rhythm because it serves us well. But you can change behaviour with crises. Another crisis that's less internal, more global, has been the water. So many of you would have, those particularly in Perth or on the eastern seaboard, experienced the millennium drought. We got habitual water-saving behaviours down to, I think this is a graph from southeast Queensland actually, to under 140 litres per person per day, unheard of. And that's because there was a crisis. And we all needed to pitch in to help. The social norming helped, by the way, because everyone was doing it. And if their neighbour was hosing down the driveway, you probably went and confronted them, right? In fact, I know in Melbourne there was a big fight. It's probably in several cities. So crises can help. But you can't necessarily bring on a crisis. You can try, but it's difficult. So a couple of studies around paying people money to try and change habits. To go to the gym, a great study done again by Uri, who I've talked about a couple of times, where he paid people, I think it was $100 to go to the gym 8 times in a month. And they were students, so $100, great, I'm in, lock it in, and they went off to the gym 8 times. The theory underpinning that is if you spend time in the gym, you like it, and we know that endorphins are produced and we're likely to continue on bad behaviour. So actually, it was quite effective, and the evidence actually showed it did work, including in the medium term. So 6 months later, it's about half to 2/3 were still going to the gym. So it can be effective. And similar story around smoking. If you pay, a guy called Kevin Volp did a study where he said, I'll give you $250 if you quit smoking for 6 months. I'll give you $400 if you quit for a year. And he found he could reduce smoking rates quite significantly, up 9% persisted actually with quitting smoking. So it's not bad in the smoking community. So income can work. Policies, particularly around laws, can be very effective at changing habits. And this is the road toll in Victoria, which has dropped dramatically over many years. And the last one, which I think is really important and probably has high relevance to your work, is when people are in times of natural change, they are much more responsive to your change tool. So when you have kids, when you graduate or get a job, when you get married, when you first get a first job, when you have kids, or when you get pregnant, a lot of kids ones here, sorry. But these are moments in our lives where we're forced to rethink what we do normally. And these are short opportunities where we can influence behaviour, where we can really make a difference. For those interested, Bas Verplanken is the researcher. He calls it the habit discontinuity hypothesis. Don't you love academics? And he showed it to be true. He showed it in energy efficiency. If you send the same toolkit out to a group of houses where people have lived there all the time versus people, or lived there for a period versus people that have just moved in, they're much more effective. Significantly more effective. And this makes common sense. And yet we don't see many campaigns that specifically target, or behaviour change tools that specifically target people who are in that moment of change. The last tool is to break the context. Because I said habits are cued by the context we find ourselves in. If you can have a little trigger somewhere in that environment that tells us to do something differently, it can be very effective. This is the urinal at the Amsterdam airport. Spillage rates reduced 70% by putting a sticker of a fly. Apart from anything, I don't even want to know how they got that statistic that 70% of spillage rates reduced. But by breaking the context, it just is a little trigger that says, actually, I need to stop and think about this behaviour. Some other really good examples. I don't know if you've seen this. This is a 3D. It's not actually 3D, but it's painted on the road like a 3D zebra crossing in Iceland, and it's supposed to make cars go, oh, okay, I need to slow down. It's being trialled at the moment. Let's hope it works, because if it doesn't, the consequences aren't particularly good. And then another one, which you've probably all seen, is musical or coloured stairs. So these are just little cues in our environment that say, something's different here, we might go down that path. And they're really useful tools. Now, I'm conscious I'm out of time, so I'm really briefly going to just cover some areas, probably in 1 minute, of the some issues that I think are going to be really topical for you in the near future. We work closely with government, right in the heart of government, with premiers' departments, but also with the politicians themselves on policy making, and these are some of the spaces in one slide that I think are going to be really important in the near future, where we're going to need a lot of public participation, community engagement. Ageing and patient-centred care. Patient-centred care in particular is growing all the time. And when I say that, I actually mean patients also involved in their own care. There's a big push in probably 3 states and certainly federally for that to happen. Part of that is the My Health record, which is a bit of a debacle, but anyway. In the environment space, waste, energy and water are 3 areas where there are going to be significant transitions, particularly energy. The world of energy is not going to look the same in 10 years' time. Definitely not. There'll be people sharing energy peer-to-peer, if some are already doing it. Batteries will be in cars, will be sources of energy supply. That will be a storage device. House batteries is the largest growing market in household tech at the moment. Energy will be very different in the future, and we need to take the community on board with it. Water, we will have another water crisis, I guarantee it. And waste, obviously, is very topical at the moment as well, particularly with the China ban. And then in social areas, I think there's 3 that really jump out. Family violence, we've spoken about. I think there's a real appetite for more engagement in communities about how they can help reduce family violence. Gender inequality, or gender equality is the positive way of putting it. I think that's a real issue, and one that there's a really strong appetite in government to fix that, and we need to engage communities, but particularly I think men, to be honest, in how we address the gaps, particularly around superannuation and pay scales and board representation and the like. And finally, inclusion, so inclusive workplaces. These are spaces where I think you guys will go out and hopefully make the world a better place. And maybe some behaviourists like us can come in on the back of your good work and change a behaviour or two. But your work is really vital. And like I started by saying, we're kindred spirits, we're working to the same goal. And thank you for listening.
Stay up here for a moment. We've got about 5 minutes for questions if anybody would like to ask. And our really high-tech Slido system is here on this sticky note because it's decided not to work right now, I think. So I've got questions, but is there a question from the floor at all first? Have we got a microphone, or are we?
I can repeat a question if someone.
That's right, we'll repeat it.
I guess so I wasn't there, so I've got the report back. I would, sorry, I said I'd repeat the question, I didn't do it. The gap between intention and behaviour is too long. So the question was, in the alcohol and drug testing and the focus group outcomes that came out, what was the reason why they said they didn't work? I guess I'd first of all ask you to put it in your shoes to say, would it work on you as a person who's not in that situation, but say it's someone who's just going to a normal medical appointment. Would it be effective if I told you that 9 out of 10 people attend their appointments on time? Would it be effective? It would? Well, you've all heard my talk, right? So now you've got to say yes. Actually, most people say no. And most people say, no, it not only would not make a difference, I don't like it. And that's including not in that community. In fact, there's 4 or 5 studies that show that. So people don't like being confronted with things that are going to change their behaviour in a non-deliberative way or in a subtle way. So deliberative means thinking about it, right? So I'm not surprised. I wrote back when they said to me, oh, we've got the focus groups, the disaster, we can't run this trial. I said, I'm not surprised. People don't like that confronting, the idea that they are being manipulated, which is what nudge techniques do, to be blunt.
Is it also because in that particular example there is that the recipient feels the person who's sitting it assumes that they're going to be one of the non-compliers?
So the question is it because it's kind of pointing the finger and saying you're going to be a non-complier? Look, the evidence around social norms and that 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 and most people are doing it is that yes, you can get backlash like that, but it still is effective. So above and beyond that. We know that from really large-scale trials, except if anyone's Irish. Anyone Irish? Social norms don't work very well in Ireland. And we don't really know why. Which goes back to the point you should always trial things, right, to see if they work. But some really classic social norms that have always worked in lots of contexts, tax and energy use, and failed in Ireland. So, don't know what it is about the Irish. But yeah, so there are audiences for whom they don't work. You can never guarantee. I go back to the fact that behaviour change is about increasing the odds. Or behaviour change research and tools and the application of it is about increasing the odds, but there is no guarantees. That's the game I'm in, is trying to improve the chances that something works. But until you trial it.
We'd love you to improve the chances of something works. In engagement, we're often got stakeholders and activists who've been activists for 20 years. They've been fighting for something for 20 years. And when we engage them, we want them to come into the room and collaborate. So the behaviour change that we're often looking for is to get activists to put down their activism and be prepared to collaborate with people who hold diverse views with them in the room. So the most obvious would be environmentalists versus developers, as an example. I'm just really interested in what your methods would tell us about how do we get that behaviour change.
So I'm going to wear the hat of a psychologist first and foremost here, rather than specifically a behaviourist. And we've worked in a few of these issues, particularly in the environment. In fact, funnily enough, I had a phone call this morning about diverse views on wildlife culling. You can imagine that's an incredibly difficult subject. What we do know is that people who are passionate about issues and have really strongly formed views about them suffer's not the right word, but let's say suffer from, from an affliction called confirmation bias. This means we only listen to messages that align with our worldview and we filter out anything that's not. Facebook does this through AI in the background, so we only ever get messages popping up on Facebook that align with our worldviews, or mostly, which is what perpetuates its popularity. Now, we know from lots and lots of research that tackling attitudes straight on is actually detrimental. You will dig people into a corner and almost certainly they will entrench their views more strongly. In my own case, I have an issue, I have a confirmation bias with Donald Trump. I cannot read anything that he possibly does that's good. And I filter out information that only sees that worldview. And actually, it's a problem. I should recognise. I mean, he might have helped peace with North Korea. But I can't believe that. I only believe it's dumb luck. So, and try and convince me otherwise and I'll only get more entrenched in my view. So the behaviourist, in terms of breaking down attitudes, and actually we're designing a study for next year, says maybe we can break down strong attitudes with behaviour. It's not a fast process, so it's not something you would get people in a focus group or in a deliberative session to happen immediately. But Bob Cialdini talks about this case study in the Korean War, where prisoners of war were captured, American prisoners of war were captured, and they were converted to communism. So people had grown up in capitalism, loved capitalism, that's their way of life, were converted. How did the Chinese do it? They got them to do small and insignificant things over time. It started by saying, capitalism isn't perfect. I don't know if there's anyone in this room wouldn't agree with that. Capitalism's not perfect. They got them to write it down and put it up in a public place. Capitalism isn't perfect. Communism isn't... Maybe not. But communism isn't all bad. There are pros of communism. You get the point. And what they found was most prisoners of war, given the choice of going back to America or staying in China, stayed in China and subscribed to communism. So you can break down attitudes. The study we're doing is around a bit more lighthearted around football fans. So trying to convert people. Oh, that's great. So we're designing a study that's trying to break down really strong opinions about your football team, which is one area that lots of people are passionate about, particularly in Melbourne. And there'll be a series of behaviours that you need to do that are indicative of supporting another team. You have to wear a little badge, you have to attend their games, you have to tip them in the footy tipping every week. And our prediction is that we can break down really strong opinions over the course of a football season. So that's my answer, which isn't really an answer because you can't do that in a short session. It takes time. And I would actually flip it to you and say, you probably got better answers of how you mediate that in an environment, a toxic environment. I'd say there are people in tools here, and number one would be finding the commonalities. And we know actually, and there's some good research around this, is that finding the uncommon commonalities is really beneficial. So in terms of breaking down barriers, there was a study done, I'm not going to remember the exact numbers or figures, but there was a study done where they got a whole bunch of football fans in the UK to write down all the good things about their team. And then they got them to walk to another building to finish the rest of the study. And then then they had this person who was in on the study jogging, and they were wearing a rival team's, is Liverpool and Manchester United, wearing a rival team's top, and they fell over and were hurt. And they looked at how many people supported them, right? And so what they found was, when they listed all the good things about their team, they were less likely to help the person who was wearing the rival team's jacket. No brainer. But when they were asked to write down the things that they liked about being a soccer fan, and then saw the same instance, significantly more likely to help that person, even in a rival jumper, a team they hated. So I think finding the common ground is the key. And like I say, there are experts in this room, I feel out of turn, articulating what they might be, but I think that's the key. And if we list things that we're passionate about and we overlap them and say, actually, we both have this in common, and particularly if it's an uncommon thing, there's some evidence to say that binds us together. Oh, wow, you like the ballet, I like the ballet. Let's talk about that, and that's the starting point. Long answer, sorry, and I probably took all my time.
That's all right. No, well, we are out of time, unfortunately. There were a couple of other questions, but I'm hoping you can stay around for some morning tea and people can speak to you individually. One of the questions was, what are your top 10 behaviour tips? That will take a long time to answer, but it might be in your little booklet. I'm going to watch for the rush towards the booklet stand over there. But in the meantime, if you could all please join with me in thanking Liam Smith.
Thanks, Donna.